In the shadow of medieval cathedrals they sat motionless, wrapped in rags, hollow-eyed and trembling with cold. To the wealthy these were not neighbors. They were warnings of what awaited should fortune fail. The air stank of rot and smoke. Church bells tolled, summoning the faithful to prayer, while the poor huddled in alleys, their whispers drowned beneath hymns. To live hungry was to live invisible. A beggar's day began with hope and ended with nothing. Some stretched out bowls carved from wood. Others held out stumps where hands had once been. The world gave them glances, not mercy. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Type it in the comments, and if you want more histories that textbooks are too afraid to tell, subscribe now to Nightmare Historians. Tonight we uncover the lives of those who lived and died as shadows. But what awaited them inside the church was not salvation, but judgment. Medieval beggars were everywhere, yet unwanted everywhere. They filled church steps, marketplaces and bridges. They begged not just for bread, but for a moment of pity in a world designed to deny it. Children grew up in the mud, their ribs visible beneath thin skin. Mothers clutched infants with eyes too tired to cry. For many, the cradle and the grave were separated by only a few winters. Disease marked their bodies. Leprosy, plague scars, missing limbs from wars that were not their own. In rags they wore their biographies, each wound a line in the story no one wished to read. Villagers stepped over them, muttering curses, crossing themselves as if poverty were contagious. To look too long into their eyes was to glimpse a mirror everyone feared. Their voices were quiet, trained not to beg too loudly. Loudness earned a boot, a lash or exile. So they whispered instead, prayers, bargains, half-sung pleas that vanished in the wind. For many, food was not bread, but scraps, bones stripped clean by dogs, vegetable peelings from market stalls. Whatever the rich threw away, the poor turned into survival. Winter was the executioner no law could match. Snow buried roads, froze rivers, and starved villages. Beggars slept in ditches, in barns, or beneath bridges where waking was never guaranteed. Winter did not just kill the weak, it revealed something far more terrifying. Some lit small fires in hollowed-out barrels. The flames kept them alive but marked them as targets. A glow in the dark was an invitation for thieves, for guards, for death. Few were born beggars. Many were soldiers crippled by war, farmers ruined by famine, or widows cast out after husbands died. Fortune turned to hunger with terrifying speed. To lose land was to lose identity. Without land, a man was not a man. Without family, a woman was not a woman. Without bread, neither was human at all. Merchants and nobles called them mummers of misery. Walking reminders that prosperity was fragile, fleeting, and could collapse with a single bad harvest. They carried their dead in silence. Infants left beneath church walls. Old men buried in shallow pits. No bells rang for beggars. No prayers marked their passing. Some towns paid beggars to leave, bribing them with a single coin to vanish beyond the gates. Others whipped them at crossroads, punished not for crimes, but for existing. And yet, they endured. Each sunrise revealed them again, still kneeling, still begging, still clinging to life with hands that shook, but never let go. And yet, survival carried a price no one was willing to speak aloud. Their faces were carved into memory, cheeks hollow, lips cracked, eyes too large for their skulls. Children who survived grew into adults already broken, and the villagers whispered, beggars were not truly people anymore. They were shadows, mouths that opened, hands that reached, lives already half dead. To touch them was to invite ruin. To help them was to waste bread. To ignore them was to survive. This was the cruel arithmetic of the medieval village. Some called them cursed, others called them thieves. But all agreed they were reminders of a truth no one wanted to face. Fortune never lasts. And when the bells tolled again, the beggars were still there, waiting, watching. Hands outstretched, eyes hollow, lives erased, yet painfully visible. But the true terror was not hunger itself. It was what came next, when the church, the law, and even mercy itself turned against them. Medieval charity was never free. At the doors of the church, the poor knelt in the mud, while priests decided who was worthy of God's mercy, and who was simply condemned. To give a crust of bread was a pious act. But for many, scraps were thrown not into hands, but into the dirt, like feeding stray dogs. Some beggars, desperate to provoke pity, disfigured themselves. Fingers burned, eyes blinded, wounds kept open, because deformity bought survival. But the self-inflicted wounds were only the beginning of something darker. The sight horrified villagers. Yet the more gruesome the wound, the more coins it could bring. Misery became a theatre, and pain the only currency, but whispers spread that beggars were not just suffering, that they carried curses capable of blighting crops and striking down children if refused. A mother in one village swore that the moment she denied bread, her infant fell sick. The story spread like wildfire, feeding centuries of superstition. Priests began to warn, deny charity and you deny Christ himself. But in the same breath, they branded beggars as thieves, deceivers, even demons in disguise. Charity became a double-edged sword. To give was salvation. To refuse was dangerous. But to give too much meant feeding the devil himself. In marketplaces, merchants made a show of giving alms, not from kindness, but from fear of what beggars might bring if denied. And still starvation clawed deeper. Children forced into begging lines, trained to cry at the right moment, their misery rehearsed like a macabre play. Children were not only trained to beg, some were forced into roles far more horrifying. Worse still, rumors grew that beggars traded in curses. A look, a touch, a whispered word. And a healthy man could wither overnight. Crops that failed, wells that soured, livestock that died without reason. All were blamed on the wandering poor. And so the act of charity became twisted with fear. To feed a beggar was to protect yourself, not them. Superstition ran so deep that even kings made public donations, fearing God's wrath if they ignored the poor at their gates. Charity was meant to save souls. Instead, it created an unholy cycle, one where misery became eternal. Because if beggars could curse with hunger, then who could ever risk denying them? In every village, the curse of charity haunted both rich and poor alike. A beggar's touch was a prayer and a threat, because every coin carried with it a fear no one dared to name. And in the silence of night, villagers whispered, "Give or be damned." Refuse and see a family waste away. Some beggars leaned into this terror. They cultivated the image of walking omens, faces painted with soot, voices croaking like spirits. Villagers claimed to see them slip into shadows, vanish into alleys, as if not men at all, but something else. By the late Middle Ages, to see a beggar at your gate was not a plea for food, but a reminder of death itself. They stood as living memento mori, grim warnings that fortune could vanish, that tomorrow you could kneel beside them. The curse of charity ensured that beggars were never merely poor. They were dangerous, necessary, and eternal. But if charity was a curse, the law itself became something far worse. To be born a beggar was to be born a criminal. In the eyes of medieval law, hunger itself was a crime. To beg without permission was to risk lashes, exile, even death. Authorities drew a sharp line: the deserving poor, widows, orphans, the crippled, versus the sturdy beggar who was branded a parasite. But what made a man sturdy? Often nothing more than the suspicion that he could work, even when no work existed. The punishment was swift. Whipped through the streets, branded with hot irons, or forced to carry signs of shame. But whipping was not the end of the punishment. It was only the beginning. Some were locked in stocks for days, their faces spat upon, their bodies left to rot in the sun as a warning to others. In England, some beggars were branded with the letter V for vagrant, a mark burned into flesh so they could never escape their fate. In France and Germany, whole groups of beggars were rounded up and driven from towns at spear point. Like cattle, others were forced into hard labor, building roads or digging ditches under guard, their chains clinking in rhythm with every step. But the most terrifying punishment of all was banishment, to be cast out into the wilderness, stripped of even the right to exist. Banishment was not exile. It was a death sentence delivered without rope or blade. Laws claimed to protect towns from disorder. In truth, they condemned the desperate to die unseen in ditches, forests, and forgotten fields. Still worse, beggars became scapegoats for every disaster. Plagues, fires, bad harvest, all laid at their broken feet. Some were accused of sorcery, their rags and filth said to conceal demonic power. In fear, they were burned alongside witches. The line between superstition and justice vanished. To look strange, to walk limping, to beg too often, was to risk execution. Yet the cruelty did nothing to end poverty. The more beggars were punished, the more they multiplied, like weeds cut down, only to grow again. For the ruling class, beggars became a living nightmare, visible proof of their failure, shadows they could never erase. Even kings issued decrees, but their parchments and seals could not stop hunger. Their laws fell like whips, but bellies stayed empty. But even kings could not silence the beggars.
Instead, something more dangerous began to form.
Soon, beggars began to resist. They formed hidden networks, brotherhoods bound not by law, but by desperation. To the authorities, these were not brotherhoods, but gangs, roving bands that threatened to overwhelm entire villages. Rumors spread of beggars who kidnapped children, crippling them to create new beggars for their ranks. Whether true or not, the fear was enough. By the late Middle Ages, beggars were not only pitied and feared, they were hunted. Laws declared open season on the poor.
And yet, with every lash, every branding, every hanging,
the beggars returned. They became phantoms of the law, driven out, beaten down, yet always reappearing, like an endless plague of hunger. And so punishment created its own monster. The poor became an underclass outside society, feared like wolves beyond the walls. But what grew in the shadows of the law was darker still. A secret brotherhood of beggars who lived by codes stranger than any kings. In the shadows of the law, beggars formed their own kingdoms, secret brotherhoods bound by hunger, survival,
and vengeance. They spoke in codes no outsider understood.
Marks carved on doors, chalk symbols on stones, signs that told who would give bread and who would deny it. These signs became their secret language. A single crooked line might mean safe to beg. A circle could mean beware, cruelty inside. But their language was not just marks on stone. It was power over life and death. Some brotherhoods crowned their own kings, ragged monarchs of the poor,
ruling with staffs instead of scepters, commanding loyalty through fear. To townsfolk,
these brotherhoods were more frightening than thieves. They seemed organized, united, and utterly untouchable. Rumors claimed beggars kidnapped children, blinding them or breaking their limbs to force them into the trade. True or not, the fear alone was enough. Mothers pulled their children close when beggars passed, whispering prayers against curses. Some claimed the brotherhood practiced dark rites, oaths sealed with blood, pledges sworn to shadows rather than saints. Their gatherings became legend, ghostly feasts where starving men pretended at nobility, crowning themselves kings of nothing. Worse still, beggar bands sometimes turned violent. Villages reported whole groups storming barns, stripping fields bare, vanishing into forests like phantoms. And when hunger pushed them too far, the brotherhood unleashed something the nobles truly feared. Authorities feared them like wolves. In some regions, the word beggar became interchangeable with bandit. To the church, they were not men but lost souls bound in sin, prowling the world like demons. Yet inside the brotherhood, they found what the world denied them: safety,
loyalty, a twisted form of family. They shared food, secrets, and shelter.
One beggar's scrap of bread was divided among 10. A single coin kept a dozen alive another day. In this way, brotherhoods became both nightmare and necessity. To outsiders, they were monsters. To insiders, they were salvation. Some brotherhoods even developed their own songs and chants,
eerie rhymes that echoed through the night as warnings and oaths. To hear them in the distance was to feel the blood run cold, a reminder that the poor were everywhere.
Watching, waiting, travelers wrote of roads where beggars would appear in groups, surrounding wagons demanding coins like highwaymen. But their reach extended beyond villages. Even travelers were not safe. Even nobles began to fear the beggars' power. For every town they were cast out of, there were 10 more willing to shelter them. They became a nation within nations, lawless, rootless, but vast. Too many to kill, too desperate to ignore, and as their brotherhood spread, so too did their legends. Some swore beggars could vanish into shadows. Others claimed they spoke with the dead. Their power was not in wealth nor weapons,
but in the terror they inspired.
Terror was their shield. Terror was their weapon. And for centuries, the brotherhood of beggars haunted Europe, silent, countless, and immortal in rumor. But death was never far. For beggars, the final cruelty was not how they lived, but how they were erased. For beggars, death brought no peace. Most were denied church burials, their bodies cast into shallow pits outside holy ground. Some were left where they fell. Ditches, forests, muddy streets, consumed by dogs before dawn, without names. Without prayers, their souls were said to wander, cursed to roam as restless shades. Villagers whispered that to see one after dark was to invite misfortune, a vision of the fate that might soon be yours. But to see them after dark was not just misfortune. It was an omen. Parents frightened their children with tales. Disobey, and the beggars will take you. Refuse charity, and the beggar's curse will find you. In folklore, they became omens, pale figures at crossroads, knocking on doors before tragedy struck. Some stories claimed they returned after death, their hunger unending, feeding not on bread, but on the living. Legends painted them as half human, half spirit, neither alive nor dead, but forever between. In truth, they were erased from history. Few records remain, their lives forgotten, their names unmarked, and yet they endured, not in books but in nightmares, etched into the fears of those who outlived them. For centuries, beggars haunted memory as warnings, proof that poverty was not just misfortune, but damnation, and in the sermons of priests their suffering became something far more terrifying. In paintings, in sermons, in whispers around fires, they became eternal memento mori, reminders of death's inevitability. Even today, ruins and roads carry their echoes. Travelers swear they feel unseen eyes watching from the dark. Historians write of kings and knights, but the poor, the countless beggars, remain shadows at the edges of the record. And yet, their story is more terrifying than any king's. A story of millions left nameless, faceless, forgotten. They remind us that civilization itself was built on their backs and on their bones. Perhaps that is why their memory refuses to vanish. Perhaps deep down we fear we could join them. But perhaps the true fear was not their memory, but the chance that we could join them. Because even kings can starve, even queens can beg, and hunger spares no one. So the poor remain with us, not only in memory, but in the way we still fear poverty, still shun the desperate. In every age, the beggar is there, at the edge of the firelight waiting, reminding us what lies beyond comfort. They are not ghosts of the past.
They are warnings
of how thin the line between survival and ruin truly is. And if you listen closely, on lonely nights, you may still hear their chants, drifting from the dark roads of history. The medieval beggar was more than poor. He was hunger made flesh, misery given voice, a terror that never died. And perhaps when you walk a lonely road tonight, the figures you glimpse in the mist are not ghosts, but echoes of the beggars no one ever claimed. Subscribe to Nightmare Historians if you dare to hear the stories that history tried to bury.